Hello and welcome to Knowledge Nap. Tonight we travel to a place of profound and desolate beauty, a place of biting wind and silence. We go to the northern Ural Mountains in the heart of Russia. Here the winter is absolute. It is a vast, empty expanse of white, broken only by the sharp edges of stone and the dark green of pine forests. The trees grow sparser as you climb, until finally you are left with nothing but snow, rock, and sky. The local Mansi people, who have herded reindeer here for centuries, know these mountains well. They have names for them. One peak, in their language, is called Kholat. This translates to Dead Mountain. They say it is a place of bad spirits, a place to be avoided. Our story begins here in 1989. It was January, in the middle of the Cold War. The Soviet Union was a place of industry, of science, and of great ambition. In the city of Sverdlovsk, a group of 10 friends were preparing for an adventure. They were students and young engineers from the Ural Polytechnic Institute. They were bright, athletic, and experienced. They were setting out on a Category 3 ski expedition. This was the highest difficulty rating, a grueling 16-day trek through the remote and frozen wilderness. Their goal was a mountain named Otorten. Its name in the Mansi language means "don't go there." The group set off with high spirits, documenting their journey with cameras and in shared diaries. Their photographs show them laughing, building camps, and skiing across the endless snow. On February 1st, they began their ascent of Kholat. They planned to cross its exposed slope and make camp on the other side. But the weather turned against them. Blinding snow and falling light likely caused them to lose their way. They made a fateful decision. They pitched their tent on the open, exposed mountainside. It was a poor location, but they were skilled enough to survive it. They ate a simple meal. They prepared for sleep. And then something went wrong. Weeks later, when the group failed to return, search parties were sent. On February 26th, the rescuers found the tent. It was half buried in snow and badly damaged. But the strangest detail was this. The tent had been sliced open neatly from the inside. The group's belongings were all still there. Their boots, their warm coats, their axes, their food, and their money, all left behind. Leading away from the tent was a trail of footprints heading down the slope. Some were made by bare feet, some by feet wearing only socks, one by a single boot. In the freezing Arctic dark, 9 hikers had fled their only shelter, unprepared, into a blizzard. They were never seen alive again. Over the coming weeks and months, their bodies were found. Some were found near the tree line, over a kilometer away. Others were found much later, buried in the snow of a deep ravine. The first dead from hypothermia, the last with injuries so strange and so violent they baffled the investigators. Massive internal trauma with no external wounds, crushed ribs, a fractured skull. One was missing her tongue. The official investigation was closed quickly. The files were sealed. The final verdict was that the hikers had died from, in their words, a compelling natural force which they were unable to overcome. That vague and chilling phrase began a mystery that has now lasted for over 60 years. What happened on Dead Mountain? What force could compel 9 experienced winter hikers to abandon their shelter and run to their deaths? Tonight, we will not try to solve the mystery. Instead, we will simply tell the story. Settle in, close your eyes, and relax. As we travel back in time and get to know the people who walked into the silence of Kholat. Before we follow their trail, we must first know who they were. They are often referred to as the group or the hikers. But they were 9 distinct individuals, 9 friends, full of life and ambition. To understand the mystery, we must first understand them. There were, in fact, 10 in the group when they began their journey. The 10th member was Yuri. He was a 21-year-old economics student. Like the others, he was an experienced hiker. But on January 28th, just as the group was leaving the last inhabited village, his health failed him. He was suffering from chronic sciatica, a severe pain in his back and leg. He knew he could not keep up. He knew he would slow the group down and put them at risk. He made the difficult decision to turn back. He said goodbye to his friends, wishing them luck. He helped Lyudmila Dubinina with her pack. He watched them leave, disappearing into the white. Yuri Yudin would be the last of them to return to civilization. His decision, born of pain and disappointment, saved his life. He would spend the rest of his years haunted by the loss of his friends and by the question of what happened to them. He was the first to identify their belongings. He was the one who confirmed the tent, the clothes, the small personal items. For him, this was not a cold case. It was the defining tragedy of his life. But for the 9 who continued, the adventure was just beginning. Their leader was Igor Dyatlov. He was 23 years old, a radio engineering student. He was the one who had organized the trip. He was a born leader, though a quiet one. He was methodical, serious, and deeply respected. His friends described him as thoughtful and immensely talented. He had designed and built a small wood-burning stove for the tent. He was constantly tinkering, improving their gear. He was not reckless. The route was his design, ambitious but achievable. He had led many expeditions before. He understood the mountains. He understood the risks. His plan was sound. His leadership was trusted. His journal entries are clear, precise, and focused on the practical details of the trek, the weather, the kilometers covered, the condition of the trail. When his body was found, his pose was one of determination. He was on his back, facing the tent, as if even in the end he was trying to return, trying to lead his group back to safety. With him was Zinaida Kolmogorova. She was known to her friends as Zina. She was 22, also a radio engineering student. Zina was vibrant, strong, and full of energy. Her friends called her the life of the party. She was known for her kindness, her wide smile, and her resilience. She was an accomplished hiker, tough and capable. She and Igor Dyatlov had dated in the past. Their romance had cooled, but they remained close friends. There was a deep bond of respect between them. Her diary entries are more personal than Igor's. She wrote about the beauty of the landscape. She wrote about the songs they sang. She wrote about the minor frictions and the deep friendships within the group. She was the heart of the team. Her last diary entry is mundane, talking about cleaning the camp. It speaks of a normal evening. When Zina was found, she was the highest up the slope. She had traveled the furthest back toward the tent. The searchers noted signs of a desperate crawl. She was a fighter. She had fought for her life and for her friends until the very end. Lyudmila Dubinina was the youngest woman in the group. She was just 20 years old. Her friends called her Luda. She was studying economics. She was known for her courage and her voice. She loved to sing, and her songs often filled the tent in the evenings. She was small in stature but incredibly tough. On a previous trip, she had been accidentally shot in the leg by a hunter. She endured the wound with a quiet stoicism that impressed everyone. She was not afraid of hardship. Her diary from the trip is filled with optimism. She describes the mountains as a fairy tale. She writes about the camaraderie. It was Lyudmila who wrote one of the most haunting final entries. I wonder what awaits us on this hike. Will anything new happen? Her fate would be one of the most disturbing. She was one of the 4 found last in the ravine. Her injuries were severe, her ribs crushed by a force the medical examiner compared to a car crash. And it was Luda who was found missing her tongue. This detail, more than any other, has fueled the darkest theories. But those who knew her remember the young woman who sang, who smiled, and who was afraid of nothing. Alexander Kolevatov was 24. He was a student of nuclear physics. This detail has, of course, been the source of much speculation. He had previously worked at a secret nuclear facility in Moscow. But to his friends, he was Sasha. He was quiet, reserved, and methodical. He was known for being orderly. He was the group's supply manager, meticulously organizing their food and equipment. He was dependable. He was Igor Dyatlov's right-hand man. While others were social, Alexander was often in the background, making sure everything worked. He was a steady, grounding presence. He was also one of the 4 found in the ravine. He was found huddled with Semyon Zolotaryov, as if for warmth. He was better dressed than the others, suggesting he had survived the initial event and had time to prepare. The quiet physicist from the secret institute remains one of the story's most intriguing figures. Did he know something the others did not? Or was he simply a good friend, a reliable hiker who met a terrible end? Rustem Slobodin was 23. He was a graduate of the institute, working as an engineer. Rustem was the group's athlete. He was incredibly fit, strong, and was known for his endurance. He was good-natured, calm, and was often the one to diffuse tension. He played the mandolin, though he did not bring it on this difficult trip. He was strong-willed. He was in a serious relationship and was expected to marry soon after the expedition. His journal entries are practical, much like Igor's. He talks about the hard work of breaking the trail, the cold, the wind. He complained of the slow pace, but never of the work itself. He was a worker. Rustem was one of the 3 found on the slope, between the cedar tree and the tent. He was found face down in the snow, in a position that suggested he too was trying to crawl back to shelter. Of the first 5, his was the only case that was not simple hypothermia. He had a small but significant fracture in his skull. It was not considered a fatal wound on its own, but it was an injury. It was the first sign that something more than just the cold was at play. The strong, steady athlete had been struck, either by a person or by a fall, or by something else entirely. Georgy Krivonishenko was 23. His friends called him Yura, though we will use Georgy to avoid confusion with the other Yuris. He was an engineer working at a construction site. Like Alexander Kolevatov, Georgy had a connection to the nuclear world. He had worked at the Mayak nuclear plant, the site of a major disaster in 1957. This too has fueled theories. But Georgy was the group's jester. He was creative, funny, and outgoing. He was the one who brought his mandolin on easier trips. He loved to joke, to take photographs, and to write poetry. He was the group's morale officer. It was Georgy and Yuri Doroshenko who were found first. They were discovered under the tall cedar tree, over a kilometer from the tent. They were dressed only in their underwear. The remains of a small, desperate fire were nearby. The branches of the cedar were broken up to 5 meters high. It appeared one of them had tried to climb the tree, perhaps to get a better view, perhaps to see if they were being pursued, or perhaps just to gather wood for the fire. The skin on his hands was torn and burned. He had fought to stay alive, to create warmth, but the cold was too fast. Yuri Doroshenko was 21. He was an economics student. He was known for being strong, stoic, and dependable. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and a tireless worker. He had a reputation for being a bit of a romantic, and was known to have a new girlfriend. He had also, in the past, dated Zina Kolmogorova. The dynamic of the group was complex, full of old friendships and past romances. But on the trail, they were a professional team. Yuri was a pillar of strength. He was found with Georgy under the cedar. Like Georgy, he was dressed only in his underwear. The mystery of why they were so undressed has a name. It is called paradoxical undressing, a final tragic symptom of severe hypothermia. As the body freezes, the brain becomes confused. Blood rushes to the surface, creating a sudden, intense feeling of being hot. The victim, in a final, delirious act, begins to remove their clothes. Yuri Doroshenko, the strong, dependable hiker, had succumbed to the cold. But the question remained, why was he here, a kilometer from his warm clothes in the first place? Nicolas Thibault Brignol was 23. He was an engineering graduate. He had a unique background. He was the son of French communist parents. His father, an engineer, had been executed by the Nazis during the occupation of France. His mother had moved with him to the Soviet Union for safety. He was known for his kindness, his good humor, and his gentle nature. He was well liked by everyone. He was also known for his camera. Many of the group's last cheerful photographs were taken by Nicholas. He, too, was one of the 4 found in the ravine months later. His fate was one of the most violent. He had suffered a catastrophic skull fracture, an injury so severe, the medical examiner said it was impossible to have been caused by a simple fall. It was a crushing, devastating blow. The gentle, kind-hearted son of a French hero had met an end that defied all simple explanations. And finally, there was the oldest member, the most mysterious, Semyon Zolotaryov. He was 38 years old. The others were all in their early 20s. He was a last-minute addition to the group. He was not a student from the institute. He was an outsider. He was a combat veteran of World War II. He had served from 1941 to 1946 and had seen heavy fighting. He had medals for bravery. After the war, he became a physical education instructor. He had joined the group to gain the certification he needed for a promotion. He was known to be strong, fit, and somewhat solitary. The students called him Sasha, the same as Kolevatov, which led him to ask them to call him Semyon instead. He was enigmatic. He had strange tattoos. One was the name Gina, another was a 5-pointed star, and another the letters DAERMUA. The meaning of this has never been deciphered. He was found in the ravine with Luda and Nikola. He, too, had massive, symmetrical chest fractures. His ribs were crushed, and yet his camera was found around his neck, preserved in the water. The film, when developed, showed nothing of the incident. Semyon Zolotaryov, the decorated veteran, the stranger, is the pivot point for many theories. Was he a KGB agent? Was he there to meet someone? Or was he simply an older adventurer who joined a group of young students and shared their terrible, unknown fate? These were the 9. Not just names, not just victims. They were the best and the brightest. They were skiers, engineers, physicists, and poets. Their photographs show us who they were. They are seen building a snow wall. They are seen huddled around their small stove. They are seen laughing, arm in arm, marching through the snow. They were competent. They were prepared. They were strong. And they were a team. They were not novices who panicked at a storm. They were skilled athletes who knew the wilderness. Whatever they faced on that mountainside, it was something extraordinary. It was something that broke through their skill, their preparation, and their courage. It was something that drove them from their only shelter into the 25-degree night. And it was something that, for 9 of them, ended their lives in the cold and the dark on the slopes of Dead Mountain. The 9 hikers were now alone. Their friend, Yuri Yudin, was on his way back to civilization. He had said his farewells and watched his friends ski away until they were just small figures against the snow. The remaining 9 turned their faces toward the wilderness. Their spirits were high. The first few days of the trek were documented in their photographs and their shared diaries. The group moved from the last logging village of Vijay and began to follow the frozen path of the Lozva River. The photographs from this time are full of life. The group is seen on their skis, poles in hand, with wide smiles. The landscape is beautiful, a pristine world of white snow and dark pine. Zina Kolmogorova wrote in her diary, "We are going. The mood is excellent." They were a tight-knit team. They moved with practiced efficiency. At night, they would pitch their large canvas tent. It was a heavy, military-style tent, but it was their home. Igor Dyatlov, their leader, had designed and built a small, collapsible stove. Inside the tent, with the stove glowing, it was warm. The group would gather, eat their meal, sing songs, and write in their journals. Zina wrote again, tired and happy. "We set about building the campsite. We are all huddles around the stove. It is a miracle." They were insulated from the world by the canvas walls and by their friendship. Outside, the temperature was dropping. Igor Dyatlov's journal was less romantic and more practical. His entries were a logbook. January 30th. Weather. Temperature in the morning, -17. Afternoon, -13. At night, -26. He noted the wind, the condition of the snow, the kilometers they had covered. His notes show a competent leader, aware of the environment and confident in his plan. The group was strong, but the mountain was stronger. By January 31st, they had reached the edge of the highlands. They were leaving the protection of the forested valleys. They were about to move into the open, exposed wilderness. They made a crucial decision. They decided to build a labaz. This is a small, hidden shelter, a cache for their supplies. They left behind a portion of their food and some heavier equipment. This was a common practice. It would lighten their packs for the most difficult part of the journey, the ascent of Mount Otorten. It was also a sign of their confidence. They were leaving these supplies with the full intention of picking them up on their return journey. They spent the day building the shelter, digging into the snow, and carefully storing their provisions. They knew they would need this food in a few days. That night they slept in the tent near their new cache. It was their last night in the relative safety of the tree line. On the morning of February 1st, they woke up, prepared their gear, and began the final push. The plan was to ascend the pass, cross the shoulder of Kholat Syakhl, and then descend on the other side. It was an ambitious day of hiking. They were now moving above the trees. The landscape here is empty, just rolling hills of wind-swept snow. The weather, which had been clear, began to turn. Dyatlov's diary entry for this day was never found, but the searchers, piecing together the events, believe they know what happened. A storm began to move in. The visibility dropped. The wind picked up, howling across the exposed slope. In the flat, white light of the storm, they lost their bearings. They likely missed the pass they were aiming for. They began to drift to the west, climbing higher up the slope of Kholat Syakhl, Dead Mountain. As the afternoon wore on, and the light began to fail, Dyatlov must have realized their situation. They were lost on an exposed mountainside in a gathering storm. He made a decision. It was a bad decision, but it may have been the only one he had. They would not try to go back down in the dark. They would not push forward into the unknown. They would camp here, on the open slope. At around 5 in the evening, they stopped. Pitching the tent in the high wind would have been incredibly difficult. They would have had to fight the flapping canvas, anchoring it deep into the dense snow. It was exhausting work in sub-zero temperatures, but they did it. They anchored their skis in the snow and tied the tent lines to them. They built a small wall of snow to block the wind, and finally they crawled inside. They were safe. They were cold, exhausted, but they were out of the wind. They were together. From the evidence found later, we know what they did next. They prepared for their evening meal. They sliced bread. They laid out pieces of sallow, a cured pork fat. They were getting ready to light their small stove, but they never did. The meal was never eaten. Sometime between 9 and 10 o'clock that night, something happened. But for now, let us leave them. In the tent, on the cold mountain, the last photographs from their cameras show us these final moments. There are blurry images of them setting up the camp. One last strange photo, a flash in the dark, pointed at the side of the tent. And then, nothing. The group and their tent were swallowed by the wind and the snow. Back in Sverdlovsk, the days turned into a week. Igor Dyatlov had said he would send a telegram. He would send it from the village of Vizhai on their return. He estimated they would be back by February 12th. The 12th came and went. No telegram arrived. At first, there was a little concern. Dyatlov was known to be ambitious. Delays were normal. The weather, the terrain. A few days late was nothing to worry about. But as the days continued to pass, the families of the hikers began to worry. February the 13th, February 14th. Still silence. The families began to pressure the Institute. The Institute, in turn, was slow to react. They did not want to raise a false alarm. But by February the 20th, a full week after the missed deadline, the search began. The first search teams were made up of students and volunteers, friends of the missing group. They were young and they were worried. They traveled to Vizhai and began to follow the group's trail. They found the group's tracks still visible in the snow. But the wilderness was huge, and the group was nowhere to be found. Soon the search escalated. The army became involved. Civilian airplanes and then military helicopters began to scour the mountains from the air. The search was systematic. The pilots flew grids back and forth over the empty white expanse. They were looking for any sign, a colored tent, a piece of equipment, a line of tracks. For days they found nothing. The mountain was empty. The pilots reported that the snow was deep and the winds were high. It seemed hopeless. The volunteers on the ground were exhausted. They were skiers, just like their missing friends. They knew the cold. They knew the danger. And with every passing day, their hope faded. They were now searching for bodies. Then, on February the 25th, a breakthrough. From the air, a pilot spotted the remains of a camp. He saw the hidden labars, the supply cache the group had built. A team was sent to investigate. They found the cache. It was undisturbed. The food and equipment were still there. This was a dark sign. It meant the group had never made it back from their ascent. They were still somewhere on the mountain. All search efforts were now focused on the area around Mount Ototen and Kholat Shachol. The next day, February 26th, the search teams were skiing along the slope of Kholat Shachol. One of the student searchers, Boris Slobtsov, stopped. He had seen something. Through the blowing snow about 300 meters away, he saw a dark shape. It was a black speck on the white slope. He called to the others. They skied toward it. As they got closer, their hearts sank. It was the tent, or what was left of it. It was almost completely buried in snow. Only the peak of the canvas and one of the poles was visible. It was collapsed and torn. The searchers began to dig. They used their ski poles and their hands. They dug out the entrance. They shouted inside. There was no answer. They pulled back the canvas. What they saw baffled them. The tent was empty of people, but it was full of their belongings. Everything was still there. 9 sets of boots lined up near the entrance, their warm coats folded, their waterproof parkas, their axes, their knives, the money in Dyatlov's jacket, the food they had been preparing laid out, the small stove disassembled. This was not a robbery, and it was not a normal evacuation. No hiker, no matter the emergency, would leave their boots. To go out into the Arctic night without footwear was a death sentence. But they had. The searchers looked at the canvas. They saw the damage. It was not torn by the wind. It was a series of long, neat slices. They examined the cuts, and they realized the most chilling detail of all. The cuts had been made from the inside. Someone, inside the tent, had taken a knife and sliced their way out. They had destroyed their only shelter from within. The searchers stood up and looked around the desolate, windy slope. Why? Why would they do this? Then they saw the tracks. Leading away from the tent, down the slope, was a trail of footprints. They were already faint, covered by new snow, but they were unmistakable. The searchers followed them. They saw a set of barefoot prints. They saw prints from someone wearing only wool socks. They saw prints from one person wearing a single felt boot. There were 8 or 9 sets of tracks, and they were not panicked. The tracks were not scattered. They did not run in all directions. The group had walked side by side in an orderly line. They had walked down the slope, away from their shelter, away from their boots, away from their coats. They had walked down toward the dark line of the forest over a kilometer away. The search party stood at the top of the trail of footprints. They looked at the empty tent, and they looked down into the distance. They knew their friends were down there, and they began to follow the trail. The searchers stood at the collapsed tent. They were cold, and they were afraid. Before them was a mystery. Their friends were gone, their boots were left behind, and leading away down the long, open slope was the faint trail of footprints. They were 1.5 kilometers from the safety of the trees. The wind on the slope was relentless. It cut through their own warm clothing. They could not imagine making this journey in their socks, but the tracks were the only lead they had. Slowly, the search party began to move. They followed the line of prints. The snow was deep. In some places they sank to their knees. They could see where the hikers had struggled. The trail of prints was orderly, as if the group had walked calmly. But this was impossible. To walk calmly, barefoot, in this cold defied all logic. Perhaps they were dazed. Perhaps they were being herded. The tracks continued down, down, down the slope for over 1 kilometer, a distance that would have taken them many long, agonizing minutes. Each step would have been torture, the snow burning their feet, the wind stealing their breath. Finally, the trail led them to the edge of the forest. Here, the trees offered a small amount of shelter from the wind, but the cold was still absolute. The tracks ended near a tall, ancient cedar tree. It stood at the edge of the woods, a massive, dark landmark against the snow, and it was here that the searchers found them. Under the cedar tree, lying side by side, were the first 2 bodies. They were Yuri Doroshenko and Georgy Krivonishenko. The searchers stopped. The moment they had dreaded was here. They were no longer searching for friends. They were recovering the dead. The 2 men were lying on their backs. They were dressed only in their underwear and socks. Their skin was frozen. This sight was shocking. But there is a known tragic phenomenon of hypothermia. It is called paradoxical undressing. In the final, desperate stages of freezing, the body's functions fail. The brain, starved of oxygen, becomes delirious. The nerves that register cold simply shut down. The victim is overwhelmed by a sudden, intense, burning heat. In their final, confused moments, they believe they are on fire. They tear at their clothes. They try to cool themselves. It is the last act of a dying body. It is likely this that had happened to Yuri and Georgy. But they had not died immediately. Between them on the snow were the remains of a fire. It was a small, sad collection of charred twigs. The men had, with their last strength, tried to build a fire. They had tried to save themselves. The searchers looked at their hands. Their fingers and palms were torn and burned. The skin was shredded. They had been grabbing at the cedar, tearing at the bark, pulling at the frozen wood. They had been shoving their hands into the small, weak flames, trying to feel a warmth that was already gone. Then the searchers looked up. They looked at the cedar tree itself. The branches were broken, not just the low-hanging branches, but branches 5 meters high, 15 feet up the trunk. The high branches were snapped and damaged. Why? Had they been trying to gather the dry, dead wood from high up? It seemed unlikely. There was plenty of dead wood on the forest floor. Or had one of them tried to climb the tree, to get a better view, to look back at the tent, to see if they were being followed, or to see if, somewhere in the dark, there was a light, a sign of help? This discovery only deepened the mystery. They had fled. They had walked 1 kilometer barefoot. They had tried to build a fire, and one of them had climbed a tall tree in the dark. The searchers documented the scene with heavy hearts. These 2 had died of hypothermia. The cold had claimed them, but the story was not over. 5 had died by the cedar, but there were 7 others. The searchers fanned out. They began to move back up the slope, moving from the cedar back towards the tent. They were following the invisible line the hikers had walked. The first they found 300 meters from the cedar. It was the group's leader, Igor Dyatlov. He was lying on his back in the snow. He was better dressed than the first 2. He had a sweater and trousers, but no shoes, no coat. His head was bare. His position was striking. He was facing the tent. One arm was raised as if to shield his face. His other hand clutched a small birch branch. His whole posture was one of defiance. He was the leader. He had been trying to return. He was trying to get back to the shelter, to save his friends. He had frozen mid-struggle, looking up the long slope toward a home he would never reach. The searchers moved on. The next they found almost 500 meters further up the slope. She had made it the furthest. It was Zina Kolmogorova. She, too, was facing the tent. She was found lying face down. The snow around her was disturbed. Her hands were abraded. The searchers believed she had been crawling. She had collapsed, risen, and collapsed again. She had fought with all her strength to get back. She was found with an ice-covered face. The strong, vibrant heart of the group had frozen alone on the vast, empty slope. A little further they found the 5th body, Rustem Slobodin. He was found near Zina and Igor. He too was lying face down in the direction of the tent. He was wearing his trousers and a sweater. Like the others, he was missing his hat, gloves, and boots. He had also died of hypothermia. But when the medical examiner inspected his body, they found something else. Rustem Slobodin had a 17-centimeter fracture in his skull. It was a long, thin crack in the bone. The examiner noted that this injury by itself was not fatal, but it would have been a stunning blow. It would have caused disorientation and great pain. It might have been the reason he could not continue. Where had this come from? Had he fallen in the dark as he ran? Had he struck his head on a rock hidden by the snow? Or had he been hit? This was the first hard evidence that this was not a simple case of getting lost. This was the first sign of violence. The search party had now found 5 of the 9 hikers. The initial conclusion was drawn. The group had, for an unknown reason, fled their tent. They had split up. 2 had made it to the trees. 3 had tried to return, and all 5 had died of hypothermia. It was a terrible tragedy. The case could have been closed there. A tragic but understandable accident, but there was one glaring problem. There were still 4 hikers missing: Alexander Kolovatov, Nicolas Thibault Brignol, Lyudmila Dubinina, and the oldest, Semyon Zolotaryov. Where were they? The search continued. March came. The snow was still, deep. April came. The mountain held its silence. The search became a grim, methodical grid. The searchers used long metal poles. They were called probes. They would stand in a line and push the long poles deep into the snow. Step, probe, step, probe. They were searching for the density of a human body, buried far below. They did this for weeks. They found nothing. The snow in the forest and in the ravines was over 4 meters deep. 20 feet of snow. It was like looking for a needle in a white ocean. Hope was long gone. The families waited in agony. The investigators were baffled. Then the season began to turn. The spring sun grew stronger. The long Arctic winter began to release its grip. The snow began to melt. On May 4th, more than 2 months after the first bodies were found, the searchers were working near the cedar tree. They were investigating a deep ravine, a natural gully, about 75 meters from the cedar. The snow here was melting, and a small stream of meltwater was running at the bottom. One of the searchers saw something, a flash of color in the deep snow. He called the others. They began to dig, and they found them. The last 4 hikers were here. They were found buried under 4 meters of snow. They were not just lying in the snow, as the others had been. They had made a shelter. The searchers called it the den. The hikers had used their knives to cut the branches off young fir trees. They had laid these branches down on the snow to create a bed, a small, insulated floor. This was a stunning discovery. It meant they had not died quickly. They had survived the initial event, whatever it was. They had had time to think. They had had time to work. They had been trying to wait out the storm, or they had been hiding. The 4 bodies were found huddled together, and they were better dressed. This was another grim and logical detail. It appeared that these 4 had outlived the first 2. They had, in an act of desperate practical survival, taken the clothes from their dead friends. Lyudmila Dubinina was wearing a hat and a fur coat that had belonged to Semyon. Semyon, in turn, was wearing Lyudmila's sweater. They were sharing and scavenging to stay alive. The searchers had found them. They thought the mystery was finally over. But when the bodies were recovered and the medical examination began, the story entered a new realm, a realm of high strangeness. These 4 had not died from the cold. The medical examiner, Dr. Boris Vozrojdeny, was deeply disturbed by what he found. He started with Nicolas Thibault Brignol. Nicolas had suffered a massive, crushing skull fracture. The doctor stated it was a depressed, comminuted fracture. The bone had been splintered and driven into the brain. It was an injury, he said, that was completely incompatible with life. He was very clear. This could not have been caused by a fall, even a fall from a great height onto rock. The force required was too great. Then he examined Lyudmila Dubinina. He found that her ribs were shattered. She had 10 broken ribs on both sides of her body. They were symmetrical fractures. They was crushed as if in a vice. And then he examined Semyon Zolotaryov. He too had massive symmetrical chest fractures. His ribs were also crushed inward. The doctor stated, for all 3, that the force required to cause these injuries was enormous. He compared it to being hit by a car at high speed. He compared it to the shock wave from a high-powered explosion. But this was the most baffling detail of all. All of these massive internal injuries had no external marks. There were no bruises. There were no cuts. There was no soft tissue damage. The bodies were not torn or mangled. It was as if they had been subjected to an immense crushing pressure, a force that had shattered their bones from the inside. This ruled out any simple explanation. No human attacker could do this. An animal, like a bear, would have torn the bodies to pieces. A fall would have left external wounds. This was something else. And then there was the final sensational detail, the one that has defined the case in horror. Lyudmila Dubinina. She was found missing her tongue. She was also missing her eyes and part of her lips and the soft tissue of her upper jaw. This discovery sent a shock wave through the investigation. It suggested a motive. It suggested a ritual. It suggested a level of violence that was almost personal. However, investigators, then and now, have a more prosaic explanation. The bodies were found in a den. There was now a running stream of meltwater. They had been lying there for 3 months. The tongue, the eyes, the lips, these are the softest tissues in the human body. It is overwhelmingly likely that they were simply the first to be taken by the water, by the bacteria, and by small forest scavengers, fish or shrews. It is a grim and natural part of decomposition, but in the context of the other injuries, it felt like something more. One final, strange piece of evidence was found. The investigators tested the clothing of the 4 victims from the ravine. They found that some of the items, particularly a sweater and a pair of trousers, showed abnormal levels of radioactive contamination. They were not lethal levels, but they were present. Where had this radiation come from? Had Alexander Kolevatov, the nuclear physicist, contaminated the clothes himself, or had they on that dark night encountered something that glowed, something that poisoned them? The mystery was now complete, and it was more confusing than ever. The investigators now had 2 completely different sets of deaths. 5 hikers found on the upper slope had died of hypothermia. 4 hikers found in the ravine had died of massive, violent, crushing trauma. The simple story of a hiking accident was gone. It was replaced by a story of terror, a story of strange injuries. The discovery of the 4 hikers in the ravine changed everything. The initial finding of the first 5, while tragic, could be explained. Hypothermia, a panicked flight, a terrible but understandable accident. But these new injuries were different. They were violent. They were impossible to explain by the cold or by a simple fall. The investigation, which had been winding down, was now thrown into chaos. The medical examiner, Dr. Boris Vozrojdeny, was baffled. He stated firmly that the 3 hikers with chest and skull trauma had injuries equal to the force of a high-speed car crash. He said this force was a high-velocity blow or the result of an immense crushing pressure. And yet, there was no external damage. The bodies were not bruised. The skin was not broken. It was as if an invisible force had crushed them from the inside. The case was no longer a simple hiking tragedy. It was a criminal investigation, or it was something else entirely. The lead investigator was a man named Lev Ivanov. He was a senior prosecutor, and he was now under immense pressure. He ordered the autopsies. He interviewed the search teams, the families, the institute staff. He collected every piece of evidence, the diaries, the photographs, the scraps of the tent. And then another strange detail emerged. The clothing on the bodies in the ravine, specifically on Lyudmila Dubinina's sweater and on Alexander Kolevatov's trousers. They were radioactive, not dangerously high, but abnormally high. Traces of radioactive contamination. Where had this come from? The investigators looked into the backgrounds of the hikers. They discovered that Alexander Kolevatov had worked in a secret nuclear facility, and that Georgy Krivonishenko had worked at the Mayak nuclear plant, the site of a major disaster. Was it possible they had brought contaminated clothing with them? Or had they been exposed to something new out on the mountain? The investigators also looked into the matter of Lyudmila's missing tongue. The medical examiner was clear on this point. He believed it was not a criminal act. He stated it was the result of natural decomposition. The body had been lying in a running stream of meltwater for months. The tongue and the soft tissue of the eyes and lips would be the first things to be taken, not by a human, but by small fish or shrews or microbes. It was a grim, but natural explanation. It did not, however, explain the rest. The investigation continued for 3 months. Lev Ivanov pursued every lead. He interviewed the local Manzi people. They were quickly cleared. He looked for evidence of other people. There was none. He looked for evidence of an avalanche. The skiers on the search team said it was impossible. The slope was not steep enough. The tent was on top of the snow, not buried under it, and the hikers' tracks were still visible. An avalanche would have wiped them all away. So the avalanche theory was dismissed. What was left? Lev Ivanov began to collect other, stranger reports. He spoke to another group of hikers who had been camping about 50 kilometers south of the Dyatlov group. On the night of February 1st, they had seen something. They described strange, bright, orange spheres or lights moving in the northern sky. They said these spheres were silent and moved at great speed. Ivanov collected more reports. Meteorologists in the region, soldiers, even members of his own search party. They had all seen the strange lights on that night and on other nights during the search. What were these spheres? Were they UFOs, or were they something more terrestrial? Were they secret Soviet weapons tests? Lev Ivanov's investigation was suddenly and officially stopped. In May 1959, just 3 months after the tent was found, the case was closed. The official files were sealed. The order came from high-ranking regional officials. They told Ivanov to close the case and to classify the findings. The official cause of death was delivered in a single cryptic phrase. The 9 hikers had died from a compelling natural force which they were unable to overcome. A compelling natural force. The words are hollow. They mean nothing and they explain nothing. It was a bureaucratic stamp on an impossible mystery. The families of the victims were outraged. They were given no answers. They were told it was a tragic accident, but they knew there was more. The files were sent to a secret archive. The area around Kolatsyakhl was closed to all hikers and civilians for 3 years. The military, it seemed, did not want anyone else on that mountain. The silence from the state was deafening, and in that silence theories began to grow. The story was whispered. It became a legend, a ghost story told by hikers around campfires. The mystery of the 9. Lev Ivanov, the chief investigator, remained silent for decades. Then, in the 1990s, after the fall of the Soviet Union, he gave an interview. He was an old man, and he wanted to clear his conscience. He said he had been forced to close the case. He said he was ordered by senior officials to bury the investigation. He said they had ordered him to remove all mention of the orange spheres. He said he believed to his dying day that these spheres were the key. He believed they were rockets or some other secret military test. He believed the hikers had seen something they should not have seen, or that they were killed by the concussive blast of a weapon. The official investigation, the one chance for a clear answer, was a failure. It was either baffled by the evidence, or it was part of a deliberate cover-up. The state sealed the files, but they could not seal the story. They could not stop the questions. And in the long decades that followed, in the vacuum of information, the theories began to take shape, from the plausible to the fantastic, each one an attempt to shine a light on the terror of that final frozen night. The official verdict, a compelling natural force, was not an answer. It was an invitation for decades of speculation. The mystery of the Dyatlov Pass incident is not a whodunit. There is no clear villain. It is, instead, a puzzle. All the pieces are on the table: the tent cut from the inside, the lack of boots, the orderly walk into the cold, the fire under the cedar, the desperate crawl back up the slope, the horrific internal injuries, the radiation, the orange spheres, the sealed files. The challenge is to find a theory, a single story that makes all the pieces fit. Over the years, many had tried. We will walk through them, one by one, from the most scientific to the most unsettling. The most widely accepted theory today, the one held by most modern investigators, is an avalanche. But this theory has a complicated history. The original investigators and the search party dismissed it. They were experienced skiers. They looked at the slope, which was only about 15 or 20 degrees. This is generally not considered steep enough for a natural avalanche. They saw the tent which was on the surface, not buried. They saw the footprints which were not erased. It did not look like an avalanche. But our understanding of avalanches has grown. The modern theory is not for a massive powder snow avalanche. It is for something more specific and more insidious: a slab avalanche. Here is how the theory works. The group, in pitching their tent, had dug into the snowpack to create a level platform. They had cut into the slope. This action, unknowingly, destabilized the snow above them. The snow on the slope was in layers. High winds had been blowing for days, depositing heavy, dense snow on top of a weaker underlying layer. This created a massive, heavy slab of snow. The hikers, by cutting into its base, had created a weak point. The avalanche may not have happened right away. The slab may have held for hours as the hikers prepared for sleep. Then, in the middle of the night, with a sharp crack, the slab released. It was not a huge slide. It was a localized, heavy, crushing event. A plate of snow, hundreds of pounds, slid down and struck the upper part of the tent. This explains the panic. The sound would have been terrifying. The weight of the snow would have begun to crush the tent, and the people inside it. They were being buried alive. This explains why they cut their way out. The entrance was buried. They took their knives and sliced through the canvas, desperate for air. This also explains the injuries. The hikers, sleeping on the uphill side of the tent, would have taken the full crushing force of the slab. Lyudmila Dubinina, Semyon Zolotaryov, and Nicolas Thibault Brignol. They were hit instantly by a force that broke their bones. The others were either hit with less force or were just pinned. Rustem Slobodin may have been struck in the head, causing his skull fracture. This explains the state of the tent. It was not buried, because it was only a partial slide, but it was crushed, and it was the source of the trauma. Now, injured, terrified, and in the dark, they fled. They had no time for boots. They grabbed their friends. Lyudmila, Semyon, and Nicholas were gravely injured. They could not move on their own. This explains the orderly walk. It was not a panicked run. It was a slow, desperate retreat. The uninjured hikers were helping and carrying their wounded friends. They were moving to the only shelter they could see, the dark line of the forest over a kilometer away. This was a tactical decision. They had to get out of the wind. They reached the tree line. They brought their wounded to the ravine to shelter them. They dug a small den in the snow. Then the group split. Georgy Krivonishenko and Yuri Doroshenko stayed by the cedar tree. They desperately tried to start a fire, to signal for help, and to provide warmth. They climbed the tree for wood, tearing their hands. They failed. The cold was too fast. They died of hypothermia, and in their final delirious moments they removed their clothes. Meanwhile, in the ravine, the 4 others were huddling for warmth. Luda, Semyon, and Nicholas died from their terrible injuries. Alexander Kolovatov, who was with them, died of hypothermia. And on the slope, the last 3, Igor Dyatlov, Zina Kolmogorova, and Rustem Slobodin. They had left the ravine. They were making a last desperate attempt. They were trying to return to the tent, perhaps to retrieve a sleeping bag, a coat, a shovel. They were the strongest of the group, but the mountain was stronger. They collapsed one by one in the snow. The cold took them. This theory is elegant, it is scientific. It explains the cuts, it explains the injuries, it explains the lack of boots. A recent study in 2021 even used snow physics models to prove that a slab avalanche on that slope was entirely possible. It is the most likely rational explanation. But for many, it leaves questions. What about the orange spheres? The lead investigator, Lev Ivanov, dismissed the avalanche theory. He believed, until his death, that the spheres were the key. This leads us to the second theory, a military weapons test. This theory states that the compelling natural force was a state secret. The context is the Cold War. The Ural Mountains were a center of Soviet industry and secret military activity. The hikers, by camping on Kholat Shachel, had accidentally entered an unofficial test range. The orange spheres were not UFOs. They were parachute flares used to light a target, or they were the glowing exhaust of a missile or a new type of rocket. On that night, the military conducted a test. The hikers were direct witnesses. Perhaps the test went wrong. Perhaps a rocket veered off course. This theory explains the evidence in a different and more sinister way. The sound of a low-flying jet or a rocket would be terrifying. The explosion of a parachute flare would light up the night sky, casting strange shadows. This, not an avalanche, caused the panic. The hikers fled the tent. But what about the injuries? This theory points to a concussive or overpressure weapon, a type of bomb that explodes in the air above the ground. It does not create a crater. It does not spray shrapnel. It creates a massive, invisible shockwave. This shockwave is powerful enough to crush internal organs, to break ribs without leaving a single mark on the skin. This perfectly describes the injuries to Luda, Semyon, and Nicholas. They were hit by the shockwave. The others, further away, were spared. This theory also explains the radiation. It was not from a nuclear bomb, but it could have been fallout from the exotic fuel of a new rocket engine, and most of all, this theory explains the cover-up. The state, discovering the deaths, would have realized they were caused by a secret test. They could not admit this. They sealed the files. They silenced the investigator. They closed the area. They invented the compelling natural force to hide the truth. This theory is compelling. It explains the human element, the secrecy, perfectly. Its weakness is the lack of hard proof. No shrapnel was ever found, no crater. The area was not a known test range. It remains a powerful and dark speculation. There is a third theory. It is stranger and in some ways more frightening. It does not involve an avalanche or a weapon. It involves the mountain itself. The theory of infrasound. Infrasound is sound at a frequency so low humans cannot hear it, but we can feel it. It is a vibration. and at the right frequency, it has a profound physical effect on the human body. It can vibrate the internal organs, the chest, even the eyeballs. This physical sensation is interpreted by the brain in one way: pure, irrational terror. People exposed to high-intensity infrasound report sudden, overwhelming panic, dread, nausea, a feeling of being watched or that a presence is in the room. The theory is that Kolatsyakhl, on that night, created a pocket of powerful infrasound, a rare natural phenomenon called a Kármán vortex street. The high winds blowing over the specific domed shape of the mountain created a powerful, silent vortex. This vortex hammered the hikers with low-frequency sound. Inside their tent, they were suddenly overwhelmed. They were not hit by snow. They were not hit by a bomb. They were hit by pure manufactured panic. They had to get away. They did not think. They cut their way out and fled, desperate to escape the feeling. This theory perfectly explains the why they fled. It explains the irrational, panicked escape with no boots. Once they were down the slope, away from the source of the infrasound, their minds cleared. But it was too late. They were a kilometer from their shelter, in a blizzard, in their socks. The rest of the tragedy then unfolded as they succumbed to the cold. The weakness of this theory is that it does not explain the violent, crushing injuries. For this reason, it is often combined with the avalanche or another theory. Perhaps the infrasound caused the panic. And then, in their panicked, dark retreat, Lyudmila, Semyon, and Nicholas fell into the ravine. A fall onto the rocks at the bottom could have caused their injuries. This is a plausible combination: panic followed by a tragic accident. There are other, smaller theories. Some believe the group was attacked. The local Mansi people were the first suspects, but they were quickly ruled out. They were peaceful. The injuries were wrong, and the hikers' journals showed no signs of conflict. Others believe they were attacked by escaped prisoners from a gulag, or by KGB agents who were there to meet Semyon Zolotaryov. This theory sees the veteran as a spy. It sees the entire trip as a cover for a secret meeting. But it is pure speculation. There is no evidence of any other people on the mountain. And then there are the fringe theories, the ones that have made this story a legend. The Mansi people have stories of the Menk, a large ape-like creature, a Siberian yeti, the blurry photograph, the one that is almost certainly a hiker, is used as proof. The massive, crushing injuries, it is argued, were the work of a powerful, non-human creature. But there were no animal tracks, no signs of a struggle, and finally, the orange spheres. The theory that they were not weapons, that they were alien craft, that the hikers were terrified or attacked or blinded by a UFO. This theory, of course, requires a belief in alien visitors, but for some, it is the only explanation that fits the high strangeness of the event. The radiation, the lights, the impossible injuries. No single theory is perfect. The avalanche is the most scientific, but it does not explain the orange spheres or the radiation. The military test is the most conspiratorial. It explains the spheres, the radiation, and the cover-up, but it lacks physical proof. The infrasound theory explains the panic, but not the trauma. The truth is, we will likely never know. The answer is lost. It was buried under the snow, and then locked away in a secret file. It is perhaps a combination of things. A perfect storm of natural and human events. A slab avalanche that caused the panic, a fall into a ravine that caused the injuries, and in the sky, by pure, terrifying coincidence, a secret military test lighting up the night with orange spheres. A series of tragedies, piling one on top of the other until they became an unsolvable and enduring mystery. The case, officially closed in 1959, was never truly over. It lived on in books, in documentaries, and in the minds of researchers. In 2019, 60 years later, Russian authorities reopened the investigation. They wanted, once and for all, to put the questions to rest. They reviewed the old files. They ran new simulations using modern technology. Their final conclusion was announced. It was, they said, an avalanche. A slab avalanche, compounded by high winds and poor visibility. It was a natural, if tragic, accident. The case was, once again, officially closed. For many, this answer is too simple. It feels too neat, too clean. It does not feel large enough to contain the terror of that night. It does not fully explain the strange orange spheres. It does not account for the traces of radiation. It does not capture the feeling of dread that hangs over the entire story. The avalanche theory is rational, but the Dyatlov Pass incident has always felt like something more than rational. The truth, in the end, may be unknowable. It belongs to the mountain. Kolatsiakl keeps its secrets. The wind that blows over its empty slopes is the only voice that remains. It whispers a story of courage and of terror, a story of a fight for life against an unstoppable, unknown force. And so the mystery endures. It has become more than a case file. It has become a memorial. We tell this story not just to solve a puzzle. We tell it to remember the 9 who never returned, to remember their hopes, their friendships, and their final, brave struggle. We remember Igor, Zina, Lyudmila, Alexander, Rustem, Georgi, Yuri, Nicholas, and Semyon. Their story has ended, and now it is time for you to rest. The questions will remain, waiting in the silence of the snow. But for tonight, let them go. Let the mystery fade. Sleep well.